In this presentation, we're going to have a quick overview of some of the basic conventions of 3D modeling and 3D design. We'll take a look at the basic Cinema 4D interface, and then we'll play around with a couple of primitive objects just to kind of get a sense of how the 3D space works. So this is the Cinema 4D interface. By now, I trust that you've had an opportunity to install and activate your version of Cinema 4D. I'll give you a real quick tour of the interface. At the top of the screen, these are our basic tools to create and manipulate 3D objects and other kinds of objects within our 3D scene. I'm going to get started by creating a cube just so that we have an object to reference inside of our scene. And so we have a basic geometry menu up here that's represented by this cube. And if I click and hold on this, you'll see different kinds of parametric primitives that pop up. And these are going to be the basic building blocks for the objects that we create in a 3D space. I'm going to select cube, and you'll see that we get a cube in the center of our 3D perspective viewport. So the center of the screen, where most of the magic happens in 3D, is our perspective viewport. We can change to different viewports, but the perspective viewport is where we're going to spend most of our time. So along the top of the viewport, we have all these tools to generate new objects, to modify existing objects, and some basic editing tools. Along the left side, we have different ways that we can restrict selections and components of given objects and influence them in very specific ways. Down at the bottom, we have a basic timeline editor. We'll talk about that much later in the course. And then over on the right side, we have our object manager. And because we have a cube inside of our scene, we have one object listed in our object manager. It says here that's cube. Currently the cube is selected, and I can tell two different ways. One is that I have these axes that are being represented in the three different dimensions here. And as I roll my mouse over these different axes, you can see that they're highlighting. In addition to that, the cube in the object manager is showing up as selected because the text is yellow. And if I deselect, just by clicking in the object manager, you can see that the cube is no longer selected, so it's no longer highlighted with yellow, and I no longer have the axes tools that are popping up in the viewport. So if I click back on the cube again, I can see that it's selected. And again, I see these axes, and we'll get back to the axes here in just a moment and how important these things are. But this is the object manager. And as we introduce additional objects, so I'll just choose a second kind of geometry, we end up with a second item listed in our object manager. Now, if I click back and forth between these two objects beneath this, these are the different properties. This is the properties panel for the objects that we have selected. So these are contextually sensitive, meaning that if I select the sphere, I have some basic sphere object properties. If I select the cube, I have the basic cube object properties. And these are parametric primitive objects, means that we have parameters like the size of our X, Y, and Z of this object, and segmentation and some other things that are governed parametrically or driven by math and some basic numbers. Now, each one of these objects that we select, there are a couple of different tabs here in the Properties Manager. We have the Basic tab. We have a Coordinates tab, which shows us where we are in space. We have an Object tab, which is mostly what we're going to be focusing on initially when we're looking at different objects. And then we have this Phong tag here. We can look at all of these tags at the same time, or all of these panels, by clicking and dragging across them. You can see that it's loading all the different properties, telling us what the basic object is, what its coordinates are, and what some of the basic parameters of the object is. Now, a lot of this information is going to be kind of redundant with other places. In fact, if we look at the Coordinates tab, this is very similar to the Position tab that we have down here in the timeline. Okay, so we'll stay focused on the Object tab for a moment. So in the Perspective viewport, we have this representation of a 3D space, a three-dimensional space, on a two-dimensional screen. And this space is represented by three axes. We have our y-axis, our green axis, which is our up axis. Okay. We have our blue axis, which is represented by z. And then we have our red axis, which is represented by x. Now, it's okay if that feels a little abstract. We'll get to know what these different axes are. And in fact, if we look down here in the bottom left-hand corner, we have a little widget here that'll help us remind us what axis is color-coded with what object. And it's important that we understand what the orientation of these axes are as we create other objects and as we make complex scenes and then output our projects to different environments. It's important that these are not arbitrary directions. So the Z space, the blue axis, is the foreground background space. And you'll notice that if you roll over one of these axes, if you click and drag, no matter how sloppy your mouse is, it restricts the motion of that object moving up and down to the axis that you've selected. If I roll over the Z axis and click and drag, you can see I'm getting this little heads up display here that's giving me a little indicator as to how far I'm moving this, and it's represented in centimeters. And if I look down here at the position coordinates, as I slide this around, you'll see that some of this information is updating down here in the position tab. So I can slide this object around, okay, according to one axis. And it's really important that when we get started in a 3D space, that we only move objects according to one axis until we get the hang of things and can align things manually, because we want to design in this 3D space. So when we're using Photoshop and Illustrator, we're typically restricted to a 2D space, which is represented by Y, so up-down space, and then X, which is left and right. But in a 3D space, we can look at things in perspective, which is one of the major advantages of designing in 3D. Now, one of the benefits of working in 3D is that not only can we manipulate the basic position of an object and all of its components, but we can actually change the camera view as well. So I have a proper 2-button mouse with a mouse wheel. So I'm going to use my mouse wheel and roll and zoom in and out. So this allows me to zoom or change the perspective. Now there's a couple of different ways to do this. Right now I'm using the mouse wheel, okay? So I can zoom in and out with my mouse wheel. In addition to that, if I roll my mouse up here to the top right-hand corner, we have a couple of different icons. This icon that's second from the left, if I click, I have not released, and I'm going to drag left and right, this will also allow me to zoom in and out. So I'm just scrolling my mouse up here, clicking and dragging left and right, and that will also do the same thing as using my mouse wheel. Okay, so I'm zooming in and out. In addition to that, if I hold down the Option key or the Alt key on a PC and I left click and drag, I can orbit. Okay, so I can change my perspective relative to the object, and in fact, I'm looking and changing the perspective of the different axes. Okay, I'm not moving the object, I'm moving the camera relative to this environment. So again, I'm holding down the Option, left click on a Mac, or the Alt key on a PC, left click. I can do the same thing up here with the icon that's just to the right of zoom. I can click and orbit. Okay. In addition to that, I can pan. There's a couple different ways to pan. Oops, let me just jump back. I changed my view inadvertently. Bear with me for a second. We'll get to that later. There's a couple of different ways to pan with quick keys. We can use this icon up here and click and drag. So this is the icon just to the left of zoom in and zoom out, and this allows us to pan. So if we're zooming in and out, we're keeping the same perspective, but we're moving our camera closer or further away from our current view. So we're actually moving the camera towards or moving away. To the right of that is orbit, and so this is probably similar to if you were to set a mug on a desk, and as you walk around the desk, you look at that from different perspectives. So if you represent your camera, if your eyes represent the camera of your world, as you walk around an object, you would be orbiting this object. Now, the pan is just sliding left, right, up, or down. So we're not orbiting, we're not zooming, we're just basically sliding the camera relative to its current view, left, right, up, or down. Okay, and you can do that by holding down the 1 key on the keyboard and left click and drag. In fact, if I hold down 1, left click and drag, I pan. If I hold down 2, we're zooming, and if I hold down 3 and click and drag, we're orbiting. So this is key number 1, key number 2, and key number 3. I like to hold down the Option key and left click, just because it's a little bit more comfortable. To orbit, I use my mouse wheel to zoom in and out, and I use the number 1 key to pan. So those are going to be the quick keys that I use. If you see orbiting, panning, and zooming, that's what I'm doing. So let's take a little bit of time. Let's jump into Cinema 4D, create an object, and just get used to moving it around according to one axis and see what happens in the perspective view. Okay, and then try orbiting, panning, and zooming. We'll talk about the relationship between different objects, and we'll reinforce this concept of only moving objects according to one axis until we get really comfortable with things. But for now, let's just launch Cinema 4D, make sure it works, create some basic geometry like a cube, and experiment with things in the interface, and we'll catch up in the next presentation.